Starship Troopers is a military science fiction novel by American writer Robert A. Heinlein, published hardcover in December 1959. The story was first published as a two-part serial in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction as Starship Soldier. The first-person narrative is about a young soldier named Juan Johnny Rico and his exploits in the Mobile Infantry, a futuristic military service branch equipped with powered armor. Rico's military career progresses from recruit to non-commissioned officer and finally to officer against the backdrop of an interstellar war between mankind and an arachnoid species known as the Bugs. Rico and the other characters discuss moral and philosophical aspects of suffrage, civic virtue, juvenile delinquency, corporal punishment, capital punishment, and war. Starship Troopers won the Hugo Award for Best Novel in 1960. Writing of the novel. Sometime during 1958 and 1959, Heinlein ceased work on the novel that would become Stranger in a Strange Land and wrote Starship Troopers. It was first published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction in October and November 1959 as a two-part serial called Starship Soldier. Although originally written as a juvenile novel for New York publishing house Scribner, it was rejected, prompting Heinlein to cease writing juvenile fiction for Scribner's, to end his association with that publisher completely, and resume writing books with adult themes. The novel was eventually published as teenage fiction by G. P. Putnam's Sons. A senior editor at Putnam's, Peter Israel, purchased the novel and approved revisions that made it more marketable to adults, and dodged the issue of whether it was aimed at children or adults. "Let's let the readers decide who likes it," he said at a sales conference. According to Heinlein, his desire to write Starship Troopers was sparked by the publication of a newspaper advertisement placed by the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy on April 5, 1958, calling for a unilateral suspension of nuclear weapon testing by the United States. In response, Robert and Virginia Heinlein created the small Patrick Henry League, in an attempt to create support for the U.S. nuclear testing program. Heinlein found himself under attack both from within and outside the science fiction community for his views. Heinlein used the novel to clarify and defend his military and political views at the time. Plot: Starship Troopers takes place in the midst of an interstellar war between the Terran Federation of Earth and the Arachnids of Klendathu. It is narrated as a series of flashbacks by Johnny Rico, and is one of just a few Heinlein novels set out in this fashion. The novel opens with Rico aboard the corvette Roger Young, serving with the platoon known as Raschak's Roughnecks, about to embark on a raid against a colony inhabited by Skinnies. Rico himself is a capsule trooper in the Terran Federation's Mobile Infantry. The raid itself is relatively brief. The Roughnecks land on the planet, destroy their targets, and retreat, suffering 2 casualties in the process. The story then flashes back to Rico's graduation from high school, where the reader sees his close relationship with his best friend Carl and the decision to sign up for federal service together over the objections of Rico's father. This is the only chapter that describes Rico's civilian life, and most of it is spent on the monologues of 2 people: retired Lieutenant Colonel Jean V. Dubois, Rico's school instructor in history and moral philosophy, and Fleet Sergeant Ho, a disabled recruiter for the armed forces. Dubois elucidates the book's moral position in matters of war, whereas Fleet Sergeant Ho's monologues examine the nature of military service, and his anti-military tirades seem primarily in contrast with Dubois. Later it becomes apparent that his attitude and display of truncated limbs are intended to scare off unmotivated applicants. Interspersed throughout the book are other flashbacks to Rico's history and moral philosophy course, which reveal that the rights of a full citizen must be earned through voluntary federal service. Those who do not perform this service retain the rights of free speech, assembly, etc., but cannot vote or hold public office. This structure arose ad hoc after the collapse of the 20th-century Western democracies, brought on by social failures at home and military defeat by the Chinese hegemony overseas. In the next section of the novel, Rico begins training at Camp Arthur Currie on the Canadian prairie. 5 chapters are spent exploring Rico's experience there, under the tutelage of career ship's Sergeant Charles Zim. Fewer than 10% of the recruits finish basic training, the rest resign, are expelled, or die in training. One of the chapters displays Ted Hendrick, a fellow recruit and constant complainer, who is flogged and expelled for striking a superior officer during a simulated combat exercise. Zim does not offer this information to his superior, but Hendrick does. Another recruit, a deserter who murdered a baby girl while AWOL, is hanged by his battalion after his arrest by civilian police. Rico himself is flogged for negligent handling of his equipment during a simulated nuclear weapons drill. Despite this punishment and his own earlier doubts about his fitness to serve, Rico eventually graduates and is assigned to a unit in the fleet. The war, officially, starts with an arachnid attack that annihilates the city of Buenos Aires. Rico briefly describes the Terran Federation's disastrous defeat of the Battle of Klendathu, during which his first unit and ship are destroyed. Following Klendathu, the Terran Federation is reduced to hit-and-run raids similar to that described at the beginning of the novel. This part of the book describes the daily routine of military life, as well as the relationship between officers and non-commissioned officers. Eventually, Rico becomes a career soldier, and one of his fellow troopers recommends him to Officer Candidate School, where he undergoes a second course of training. En route from the Roughnecks to OCS, Sergeant Rico encounters his estranged father, now Corporal Rico, in transit, and reconciles with him. Sergeant Rico is commissioned a temporary 3rd lieutenant for his final test, a posting to a combat unit. Under the tutelage of his company commander, Captain Blackstone, and the aid of his platoon sergeant, Zim, Rico commands a platoon during Operation Royalty, a raid to capture members of the Bugs, Braincast, and Queens, and graduates as a 2nd lieutenant. The final chapter serves as a coda, depicting Rico aboard the Roger Young as the commander of Rico's Roughnecks, preparing to invade Klendathu, with his father as senior NCO. Major themes. Politics. Starship Troopers seems to have been meant as a political essay as well as a novel. Large portions of the book take place in classrooms, with Rico and other characters engaged in debates with their history and moral philosophy teacher, who is often thought to represent Heinlein's opinion. The overall theme of the book is that social responsibility requires individual sacrifice. Heinlein's Terran Federation is a limited democracy, with aspects of a meritocracy in regard to full citizenship. Suffrage can only be earned by at least 2 years of volunteer federal service. The franchise is today limited to discharged veterans, instead of, as Heinlein would later note, anyone who is 18 years old and has a body temperature near 37 degrees Celsius. The Federation is required to find a place for anyone who desires to serve, regardless of skill or aptitude. There is an explicit contrast to the democracies of the 20th century, which according to the novel, collapsed because people had been led to believe that they could simply vote for whatever they wanted, and get it, without toil, without sweat, without tears. Indeed, Colonel Dubois criticizes the famous U.S. Declaration of Independence line concerning life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness as unrealistic. Military history, traditions, and military science. The Korean War ended only 5 years before Heinlein began writing Starship Troopers, and the book makes several direct references to it, such as the claim that no Department of Defense ever won a war. Heinlein also refers to the American prisoners of war taken in that conflict, including the popular accusations of communist brainwashing. After the Korean War ended, there were rumors that the Chinese and North Koreans continued to hold a large number of Americans. Rico's history and moral philosophy class at Officer Candidate School has a long discussion about whether it is moral to never leave a single man behind, even at the risk of starting a new war, and Rico questions whether it was worth it to risk two nations' futures over a single fellow soldier who might not even deserve to live by some standard, but concludes it doesn't matter whether it's 1,000 or just one, sir. You fight. Several references are made to other wars. These include the name of the starship that collided with Valley Forge, Ypres, a major battleground in World War I, the starship Mannerheim, a reference to the World War II-era Marshal of Finland, and Rico's boot camp, Camp Arthur Currie. A brief reference is also made to Camp Sergeant Smokey Smith, named after a Canadian recipient of the Victoria Cross in World War II. The airport was the location of the U.S. Army Air Corps Walla Walla Army Air Base in World War II. The 91st Bomb Group lays claim to being the first Army Air Forces outfit to use that base. Another World War I reference was the phrase, "Come on, you apes. You wanna live forever," which comes from Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Daly at the Battle of Belleau Wood. This phrase, however, has been attributed to various people throughout military history, including perhaps the earliest documented citation by Frederick II of Prussia when he was meant to have said, "Rascals, would you live forever?" at the Battle of Culloden. The starship corvette Roger Young was named after the World War II Medal of Honor recipient, and lines from the chorus of Frank Lowe's Ballad of Roger Young are used as the ship's recall signal. Another war reference, this one from the War of 1812, involves some implications of the court-martial of 3rd Lieutenant William Sitgreaves Cox, which are discussed in some detail. Responsibility. Juan Rico begins the novel with no thought of his personal responsibility or of any particular group's responsibility to self or others. This theme is obliquely addressed in the novel's opening. We had all inspected our combat equipment. The acting platoon sergeant had gone over us carefully after he mustered us. And now Jelly went over us again, his eyes missing nothing. Now I was going to have a hole in my section and no way to fill it. That's not good. It means a man can run into something sticky, call for help and have nobody to help him. I've heard tell that there used to be military outfits whose chaplains did not fight alongside the others, but I've never been able to see how that could work. I mean, how can a chaplain bless anything he's not willing to do himself? In any case, in the mobile infantry, everybody drops and everybody fights, chaplain and cook and the old man's writer. The theme is repeated through flashbacks to high school and officer candidate school in a required class called History and Moral Philosophy. In this view, everything from the right to vote to the punishments for various crimes are depicted as part of a larger effort to recognize society's needs and improve society, as distinct from self-interest. The service Heinlein envisioned was an all-volunteer service, long before the U.S. military had changed to an all-volunteer model. Other than the rights to vote and hold public office, there is no other restriction between service veterans and civilians. In the course of both the current plot and flashbacks, Rico learns to take responsibility for ever-increasing groups, himself, his comrades, and eventually all of mankind, and accept that as the reason for remaining in the service. Further, Rico is seen to develop from a relatively powerless citizen to a very dangerous fighter. There are no dangerous weapons, there are only dangerous men. We're trying to teach you to be dangerous to the enemy. Dangerous even without a knife. Deadly as long as you still have one hand or one foot and are still alive. Military innovations. In addition to Heinlein's political views, Starship Troopers popularized a number of concepts and innovations in military engineering which have since become broadly present in other science fiction and some of which have been paralleled in real-life research. The novel's most noted innovation is the powered armor exoskeletons used by the mobile infantry. These suits were controlled by the wearer's own movements, but powerfully augmented a soldier's strength, speed, weight carrying capacity. and jumping ability, and provided the wearer with improved senses. A completely self-contained personal environment including a drug dispensing apparatus, sophisticated communications equipment, and tactical map displays. Their powered armor made the mobile infantry a hybrid between an infantry unit and an armored one. Another concept the book pioneered was that of spaceborne infantry. The heavily mechanized units of MI troops were attached to interstellar troop transport spacecraft, which then delivered them to planetary target zones. By dropping groups of mobile infantrymen onto the planet's surface from orbit via individual re-entry capsules. The uses for such a force, ranging from smash-and-burn raids, to surgical strikes, conventional infantry warfare, and holding beachheads, and the tactics that might be employed by such soldiers are described extensively within the novel. The tactics, training, and many other aspects of this futuristic elite force are carefully detailed. Everything from the function of the armored suits themselves, to the need for multiple variants of powered armor, to the training of personnel in both suit operations and the specialized unit tactics that would be needed, to the operational use of the suits in combat. Influence with U.S. military. While powered armor is Starship Troopers' most famous legacy, its influence extends deep into contemporary militaries. Over half a century after its publication, Starship Troopers was on the reading lists of the United States Marine Corps and the United States Navy. It is the first science fiction novel to have appeared on the reading lists at 3 of the 5 United States military branches. When Heinlein wrote Starship Troopers, the United States military was a largely conscripted force, with conscripts serving 2-year hitches. Today the U.S. military has incorporated many ideas similar to Heinlein's concept of an all-volunteer, high-tech strike force. In addition, references to the book keep appearing in military culture. In 2002, a Marine general described the future of Marine Corps clothing and equipment as needing to emulate the mobile infantry. In 2012, an article on the U.S. military buying ballistic face masks specifically referenced the big steel Gorilla S of Starship Troopers. Critical reception. Alexei Panshin stated that the novel was an account of the making of a Marine, and nothing more. The primary negative assessment of Starship Troopers is that it is nothing more than a vehicle for Heinlein's political views. John Brunner compared it to a Victorian children's book, while Anthony Boucher, founder of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, remarked that Heinlein had forgotten to insert a story in his review column for F&SF. Damon Knight selected the novel as one of the 10 best genre books of 1959. In a 2009 retrospective, Joe Walton finds Starship Troopers military SF done extremely well. Heinlein was absolutely at his peak when he wrote this in 1959.